Welcome to Surfacing. In this month's deep dive, hosts Lisa Welchman and Andy Vitale explore a much debated topic. Should designers learn how to code? The conversation took an interesting turn as the two begin to consider the way that teams are structured around the web and discuss new possibilities about how design and technology teams can work together.
I think today that we said we wanted to, or I said, I wanted to address that pervasive argument that everyone in the design community can't stand, which is of interest to me because I'm always a bystander in this debate, which is, should designers learn how to code?
Yeah, I think we can say no, and it becomes our shortest episode of all time.
Yeah, exactly. It's always fascinating, though, because on whatever social media platform, and it's usually Twitter, but I'm not on a lot of them, but I think Twitter is particularly, people get really impassioned about it. And I just find it really fascinating, and whether or not it's why is everyone so upset about even the question happening? Yeah,
I have no idea. To me, people should do whatever they want to do, whatever makes them feel right. When we talk about designers, I get the argument that, hey, there's different types of brained people and creative people are not really great at understanding code, but that's not entirely the case. I think of myself, and math's definitely not my strong suit, but the creative side of me is. And I've tried to code. I understand code. I think, can I actually write code? Does anyone want me to write code? At this point in my career, I don't know if anyone even wants me to design a lot of things. But, the ultimate goal of the person creating the thing is to be able to create something that communicates to an audience their intent. And whether that's, a drawing on a napkin, or it's a wireframe or a mock-up or a prototype or code, it's whatever that person needs to communicate that idea as easily as possible to someone else.
Yeah, when I hear that, the first time I ever heard that question, which was many years ago, and, I have an interesting background as it relates to, web development, web design, which is I'm in that first generation of webmaster types, right? So when I was at Cisco Systems, those were the years, the mid to late 90s, where everybody just did everything. You got the web server up and running, you found the search software, you indexed the website in the search software, you designed web pages, you did the HTML code by hand. That was the webmaster. And it's interesting because even, 25 years later than that, it's still the case that I run into some groups where there are people who still function in that way. But for the most part, people have started to specialize. And so, but my hands-on history was just kind of doing everything. And so for me, when I think about that question, I'm like, well, yeah, those are completely different disciplines, right? Whether or not to do well, right? But I also have to say, as a management consultant who's around digital teams, which include designers and content strategists and technologists and, librarians, all sorts of skill sets, it's very helpful to understand what they do, right? And because I did all of those things a little bit, and, I know Prolog, which is coding language nobody uses, right? But I understand code and I understand the logic of code. And I think even more importantly, I understand the limitations of it, right? And what it can and cannot do. And that doesn't mean you can't try to push or pull things, but I think being informed about those things and understanding how they work just makes me better. And it makes me a better team member. It makes me able to coach other folks better. And it helps me actually have a sense of empathy for everybody on the team because I get what the limits are, right? And what can and cannot happen. And so when I hear designers push back with this kind of like, stop, I don't even want to look at code or even know what code is, it just seems really harsh and not team-like. Right? Do you know what I mean? To not be interested in it at all. I don't believe that anyone expects a designer to be as a developer, right? Or maybe some people do, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm not saying you need to be as good at code as you do at design, but to at least understand it. I mean, is that an unreasonable thing you think, or how
No,
about, I guess a better question is, you said you know how to code a little bit. Do you think that makes you a better designer?
I think it helps me understand the limitations of some of what I'm doing. Like you mentioned, I have not come across many or any that I can think of designers that are like, I don't want to know anything about the code. I think it's, I don't want to code, which is fine, but it's, I know I need to understand the limitations of this platform or the capabilities of this platform so that I can actually work in it and collaborate with the development team. I think there's a piece of it that is like, yeah, at some point, if you just knew like a little HTML and CSS, you can make some changes yourself. But I think as you know, engineering language has evolved, the core of all of this, I think, is just speed to delivery, like we talk about many other times. I think when you can get something from an idea to something tangible that's live quicker, it always seems more beneficial. And I think, as you mentioned, in the early days, it was a webmaster, it was someone doing this work. And, you know, even as people that went to design school or learned how to, you know, design in a school like I went to, we learned how to use Dreamweaver. Mm-hmm. And Dreamweaver was a tool that we can actually create design layouts, and it wrote the code for us. Now the code it wrote wasn't clean.
Yeah, it was
clunky,
really crappy.
But it was something. Yeah, but I mean, we could launch a site. It was only at the point where maybe I didn't work on my own or started to work on bigger projects or in larger organizations that I realized, like, hey, the code this creates is shit. Like, we need experts that can take this idea that I have and turn it into like clean code that doesn't slow down the design or understands the design. So it's interesting to see, and I wonder if, you know, as engineers are learning in school today, like, are they learning design programs at all too?
Yeah,
I mean,
I think that is, I don't know the answer to that question. That's an interesting question. And when you described Dreamweaver and all the WYSIWYG, you know, web editors that were out there, which, you know, was it Hot Banana, Front Page, Dreamweaver. I mean, there's a whole cycle of generations of this stuff, which seemed fun, and I never liked, because I learned HTML and Notepad, and also I knew how to code, so I knew what clean code ought to look like, even though HTML isn't code, it's markup language, right? Which is a difference. That's the other thing. That's not code, it's a markup language. And so I think it's, but what I find really interesting and maybe a little not quite even keeled is the sort of distress call from the design community when there are tools that allow coders to quote unquote design. Right. So you said, wow, it's really great. We got this stuff up faster. And yeah, I learned eventually that it made nasty code, but we deployed it faster and it looked good. Right. But you were killing the technologist. Right. And so on the other side, now you've got a set of tools where technologists or regular business people can design, quote unquote, design stuff and deploy it faster. And so you've got the flip side, and you have, and I don't know, maybe it's just the design community's louder than the code community, but the screams that you get when technologists do the same behavior, right, on the other side are just really loud from the design community. And I'm probably not going to win any fans on this, but there just seems to be a little bit of a preciousness in the design community about the work that gets done. Like, you know, we are kind of super special. And I don't know if it's because the work that they do is visual, and the visual aspect of it is very heralded, right? You can really, really see it. I mean, the number of people who are going to complement the superficial aspects of a user experience, like the visual aspects of a user experience, versus the people, who are going to say, wow, that's really elegant code, right? It's just no different. And so I think to a certain extent, the design community eats up that the same way that, founders who get millions of dollars think they're geniuses because they've got millions of dollars, right? Because everybody's telling them, you're so great. I think people tell designers, look at this great experience you created. And they're eating that up and getting a little bit over pumped up on that. Whereas I think we all know that underlying a really good experience is creatively and beautifully architected code, right? And things like single sign-on. Right? I mean, you can make the best visual experience, but if I've got to enter that, my name and address 72 times or whatever. So I don't know, maybe, like I said, I'm probably not winning any friends, but it feels like there's a little bit of lack of balance. I don't know what you think about that.
So I like that you pointed it out because I am part of the design community, I don't notice it in the same way. And I think that is interesting to me because as designers, we often talk about empathy and understanding. So it feels like what I need to do is take a different perspective or a different look at the way we communicate and talk to see if I can see what you're seeing. Because I off the top of my head, I'm like, I don't know that I agree because I don't see that all the time. But I do, at least with the designers' voices being loud in the community, I guess I could, maybe. Again, it's hard to see. It's almost like looking at yourself in the mirror every day and then, 6 months later, you gain 15 or 20 pounds, but you don't notice it till you see that before and after photo. Like in the moment, you don't actually see these things as they appear. So it's the interesting part, though, for me is now that I definitely don't do a ton of hands-on design, but back when I was, having the opportunity to work with a really good front-end developer or UI engineer that were able to take designs or just understand the design component or the front-end language to communicate ideas, some of that collaboration and some of the ideas they brought to me were it was great. It was a partnership. It was very different than earlier when, I would create a design and it was more of a handoff. It was more of a, what happens to it? Oh, wait a minute, this goes live and the code or the final output doesn't match my designs at all. So I think as both front-end development and design have evolved into creating products in mature organizations, I feel like the quality and collaboration has gotten better. But now we're at this other point where it's becoming territorial. And what I'm starting to see are these titles like UX engineer or, UI engineer, creative technologist, design technologist are popping up. And I'm curious why that's happening. I mean, my theory on it is we are losing front-end developers in a lot of organizations because they're looking for that one person that can do it all. So they're going full stack. And I've seen this in the last few companies. We've had full stack engineers and not people really focused on the front end. And when we go through the demos, we're like, hey, wait a minute, this doesn't match the comps. And we're using tools that kind of, are easy to communicate between designers and developers. It's easy for them to see the CSS and HTML attributes. It's easy for them to see spacing and grids, but they're just not matching and they don't see it because we're looking at things from a different perspective. And it's not until we overlay the mock-ups on the actual live code and the demo environment that they see that, wait a minute, this is actually off by 5 pixels, but there's no desire to fix that. So the designers are like, well, I should be working with front-end developers in partnership, but I'm not because there are none. So now we have to hire our own so that we can have this and then plug it into the back-end system. And, that's the same reason why companies are like, let's hire a product designer so that they can do multiple disciplines at once so that we can get more out of a single person instead of having 3 specialists. So it's an interesting transition to see how it's gone kind of full circle, but not. I don't know. I don't know the point I'm making here. It's just there's so many. This designer's coding is a lot bigger than I think I thought when we talked about having this conversation.
Yeah, well, my perspective on this is fascinating to hear you talk about this, because it's really bringing back an opinion that I've had for many years, probably the last 10 or 15 years, about the way web/digital teams are formed inside of an organization, which is, stepping back a little bit, one of my favorite topics is understanding how the internet and web impact how an enterprise must function. You've probably heard me say that a million times. Yes, it's interesting to see how they disrupted banking and higher education and elections. All of that stuff's really wild too. But to me, the really, really subtle and interesting thing is how business and employees must interact differently within that business because of these digital spaces that have opened up. It's just really subtly pushing on these models. And one of the things that existed prior to the advent of the commercial web was this IT and marketing component. Right. And so and the business. So IT, marketing, and the business have been arguing with each other prior to the web. Right. And they'd staked out their territory. IT tends to claim that territory with control. Right. They're heavy on policy. I'm going to yank the server down. No, I will not deploy that. I'm going to shut you out. That's how they control that kind of stuff. The business's control mechanism is often money. We're making the money. We have the money. You IT and you marketing, you don't make any money for us. We pay your bills. Do what we say, right? And marketing's over here, and their power is we are the front face of the organization. We are the voice. We make all the colors. We do all the stuff, right? So you've got this kind of interesting trifecta of things going on. And then here comes the web inside of it. And what's interesting to me is digital is all three of those things together. But because those organizational units existed prior to the web, they're false. Right? They're false piles. The reality is, and I've always said this, if you want to form a digital team, one of the best formed digital teams I ever saw was very early on, 2001, one of the big financial services firm had a digital team that had everyone, the technology people, the tech, quote unquote, tech people, the design people, everyone, all together in a pod stuck off of the CEO's office. So in some sense, it's maybe the search version of a chief digital officer. They didn't call it that, but, I've had mixed feelings about that title as well, but just pushing that aside for a second. But everything that you needed was in that group, right? And so there was no arguing with anybody. It's if you needed front-end development, even though I don't think they called it then you got it, right? Whatever you need, you got. And so this idea that there are these disciplines that are different from one another and almost to a certain sense disassociated, to me is odd. Looking in as a management consultant from the outside, I'm you guys are building the same thing. Or people, not guys, you people.
I think that's become the argument for designers having a seat at the table, that separation, because, the last few places that I've worked, going back to, I don't even know when I actually, the bank I worked at last, when they went through the merger, in the beginning, when I started there, design reported into IT, into technology. So it was all right, well, technology felt like they were a service organization to the business or to product. And then because design reported into technology, they felt like they were in control of the velocity of the design team. And I always heard hey, we're waiting for this stuff. We have, developers or engineers with hands-on keys and it costs X amount of dollars while they wait. And then we went through the merger, and then design and product were in the same organization. And it really was a single organization. So it felt like here's 2/3 of the triad of product, design, and technology. And then technology is on the outside, and technology is the service to the organization, and design and product were more aligned. And it really that's where I think that having that triad of product, design, and engineering makes sense, because there's a group of three. So whenever there's a decision to be made, it's always it's either unanimous or it's two agreeing and one has to kind of like accept that decision.
Go along. Yeah.
So I think that's good, but I think having them all in the same organization is interesting only because I don't remember a time that I can really point to that I remember that having been a thing. And I wonder if it would solve so much like of the petty bullshit that goes on over like territory wars and decisions and who's pointing fingers at who and blaming who. You know, where I'm at now, we've got a pretty good relationship with our partners. It's up to us to figure out as we mature and evolve, and mature is such a weird word, but as we evolve as a product organization or product competency within an organization, we need to make sure that we're all involved lockstep through the process from when ideas are being generated or insights are being gathered all the way through when we're launching things and learning from what data we gather, whether it's qualitative or quantitative through the process. And I think there's still room to involve each party along the way. But, you know, I'm going in a further direction because you mentioned the triad, but going back to like just our original should designers code, I just want to bring it back to that for a moment. And, you know, we both kind of agreed that the answer was no, but I don't know that we really dove deep onto, yes, they're separate skill sets. They need to be aware of the capabilities of each other and, you know, the limitations of how each other work. You know, to me, that's the same thing. When we briefly talked about it, I said that's like, you know, hiring a plumber to do my electrical work. Like maybe they could do it. I wouldn't want them to do a huge project. And you started to talk to me about when you had some work done and, you know, you had someone come in and tear up a wall and they were like, that's not my job to put it back together.
Yeah.
You know, it's there are specialists and there are generalists, and, you know, I would call a handyman to paint something or fix something small, but I wouldn't want them to do the job that someone else is a lot better and more qualified to do. So I think that's why designers shouldn't code. Not saying there aren't designers that can express and communicate better with developers in a language they understand, but I wouldn't expect that of every designer.
Yeah, I mean, you just said a lot, and it's interesting to hear you talk. You know, I think one of the things that gets missed here from where I'm sitting, from a governance and collaboration perspective, is folks just not understanding that you need to design a team that's fit for purpose.
Yep.
And so just going back, it's what's happening is organizations are retrofitting a team that was designed to do something completely different, definitely not make things and put on the web, definitely not craft a user experience that spans the capacity of 5 business units and 2 major core infrastructure disciplines, marketing and IT, inside of an organization, plus a little records management and infrastructure stuff as it relates to metadata and taxonomy when you start throwing personalization in, right? And so one of my arguments for the work that I do is that no one's ever stopped to design the team and said, look, we're trying to create a comprehensive user experience that involves a team with many different disciplines and people with a certain amount of knowledge, right? That would be the business, knowledge about the market, and a certain expectation about what they're trying to achieve. Given that this is the overall experience that we're trying to create, that's the strategic component, what we're trying to achieve here, what is the best team structure to support this?
Right.
And I would imagine if most people actually stopped and did that exercise, because this is what I do all day, it's not the team they have. And so instead, people dig their heels into where their ego is sitting, which is, I went to school for this, whether it's IT, marketing, business, whatever. This is what I know. I'm an expert. And it's interesting because there's so many UX people in this that they're basically putting themselves in front of the experience that the customer is going to have. And in sometimes their own business interests on the whole, because the governing mechanisms inside of the organization are siloed, and the power of each silo is sort of trumping creating this overall experience. And so I just think there's just not enough attention being paid to just a very fundamental thing, which is our team organized in the right manner to get this work done?
Right.
So instead we're talking about, let's argue about some old roles that we've had forever. Designers versus coders versus, I mean, it just doesn't even make any sense. On every click on every page, 5 or 6 disciplines are represented.
Right. Exactly.
There's content on every page. There's an interface on every page. There's code. There's a hosting infrastructure underneath that's going to make that page break. I mean, think about all of the vaccine websites that can't take the load.
Right.
Right? Because somehow there's some disconnect with IT that nobody said the governor or the president or whatever is tell everybody to go hit this stuff. That used to be like, it doesn't happen much anymore, but you remember every time there was a Super Bowl ad with a URL in it, it was like clockwork. It was like nobody told IT, you know what, we've got this ad. And, probably millions of people are going to click this link at 3:30 on Sunday afternoon or whenever. I don't watch football, so whenever that happens. And, or American football, I should say, so I don't get beat up by everybody else in the world. But, and I always used to look at that and I was like, okay, technologically speaking, I know that there is a server and host infrastructure that can handle that load, right? And 2, it probably doesn't cost that much, right? Why is that broken? And so it's these unnatural rifts, right, that happen, and it's a poorly designed team. And so I think that question of should designers code, should coders design, is a non-question to a certain extent.
Right.
Because honestly, if the team were properly designed, it's kind of like saying, let's take a musical example. For example, either an orchestra or a rock band. I'll say rock band because more people know, just a 4-piece ensemble. Most people know that 4-piece ensemble better than an orchestra. But I would expect that the guitar player at least kind of gets what a drummer can and cannot do.
Right.
And that after playing in that same band together, also understands where some of the stress points are or aren't, or might even be able to play a little drum at a certain point after just watching them for a while because you're interacting and collaborating with each other. And so for me, that's the hope, that if you can get the team designed properly, people will interact so that designers will intuitively know as they're designing, oh yeah, I worked with a front-end developer the last time. I'd like to do it this way.
Right.
But I know that's going to be like 18 more cycles or whatever. Or, our taxonomy isn't a faceted taxonomy, so we really can't do it like that. Or maybe they say, but we really should do it like that. And then they go to the taxonomy people and say, hey, I don't want this hierarchical mess. I want a faceted one because this is how it's going to work. And they have that conversation, which is collaboration instead of fighting.
And that's so reliant upon what you talked about of having the right team built. Because I see in a lot of places, I hear from a lot of designers like, hey, I work on this thing in this area, but I'm not 100% dedicated to that. And neither are, the engineers. So they just kind of pick something up and move on to the next thing. And it's so important in large enterprise. Our teams are dedicated to the problem spaces because they need to learn that knowledge, not only of the customer and the business, but the capabilities that we're building. So you're not working with a different, engineer that's reinventing the wheel the next time around or doesn't know the struggles that we had for the last 3 months over the limitations of like single sign-on or dual factor authentication that impacts the experience. So it is that's the solution. Is each team may be different, each problem may be different, but I think somebody needs to collectively or individually like design that team, organize that team so that they can tackle those problems the right way.
Yeah, I'm of course going to violently agree with you on that one because it's interesting. I always say I'm not a designer, but I am a team designer. I'm a designer of groups, and it is frustrating for me to see how much people are just running into each other for no reason. Everybody usually has the same intent. They want it to work well.
Right.
I mean, even the ones that folks like to complain about the most, IT, it is actually because they are very policy oriented, because historically that's just part of their culture, is to be, there is oriented around security and privacy policy as the marketing team is oriented around brand, right? So each one has their own area that they like to protect, and that's good because we need somebody to protect those areas as well. But they're, for the most part, unless you work in a hyper-controlled, regulated industry like the financial sector or pharma, or if you're in other certain parts, certainly in the US, it's looser than it is, say, in Europe with GDPR. But most people are trying to get it the most that they can within the bounds of the law out of the experience for the organization, right? And for good and for bad. Sometimes that's led to some sticky experiences that maybe didn't need to be so sticky, right? But for the most part, people are trying to do that, and they're trying to do their job well. What do you see, since we seem to be agreeing that the team's poorly formed, right? Right. What do you think folks can be doing from where you're sitting as a team lead, knowing that, I walk in, if somebody's hired me, they're basically saying, we know our team is poorly formed, reform us, Lisa. But even then, getting them to make the changes that they need to make is really, really tough, right? Because people don't want to undermine that. But you're in the position where you're leading a team, and, sometimes people just don't have the time or the energy or the will to actually turn that team over. I mean, what do you think would be, based on our conversation, some easy steps, or not easy, just steps that people could take to lean more into that direction of a richer collaboration in an environment where the people who are creating the digital experience are operating in silos? I mean, we like to talk about silos all the time, but when digital people talk about silos, what they're usually saying is, I hate those people over in business, or I hate those people. They're not thinking, wow, we are siloed. Right.
Exactly.
Like, we are siloed. And so I'm keeping it in the family of people who are making digital and forgetting about all those other silos, which are problematic. It's another conversation. But what do you think can happen in that space?
I know. For me, in my role, it really is about identifying the opportunities to improve, whether that be the quality of the output of the design team, or the relationships that we have with our partners, or the holistic, like, what's not working as we try to collaborate to produce better outcomes in our products for our customers. So it really is a lot of, like, just understanding perspectives from all sides. Talk to them. What's working well, what's not working well, making sure that they understand, they can see the picture. And if they don't, it's educating them on a proper process for a team to produce products, and look to, best practices and examples of what had worked well in the past. And you build those relationships so that you can get people to try it. Let's pull together a small team. Let's try it this way. And if it works, you can scale that. And, we're doing that now. We're identifying a little bit better way to help the designers understand their specific roles and responsibilities, and then work on working agreements with our partners, and then figure out how we can carve out this small group of people to try something just a little differently to see if it works. And if it works, we scale. And then, in a position like I have now, like we have, having a voice that people can listen to, and the ability to share these experiences publicly, we can even further create best practices or examples of what had worked and help other people that are struggling with the same problem in other organizations. So it really does just start at, like, assessing the landscape and building those relationships to get the opportunity to trying it, seeing what works well, what doesn't work well, and taking what worked well and continuing to iterate until you hit it right. Because it might be slightly different in any organization, but the key foundational elements of, like, these parties in this working relationship, like, if they work this way, if we build things together, like, the outcomes are going to be the same most of the time. And share that. And that might work well for someone else, or it might hit 50 or 60%, but it's foundational that they can build upon.
Yeah. Those are good things. I think for me, in answering my own question, I'm going to go big or go home on this one, which is, I think that the root of the problem is that the compensation structure for and how success is rewarded is skewed towards an old model. Right. So if people got bonuses based on how well an experience was architected and operated cohesively rather than down their particular organizational silo, right? So there's marketing performance objectives and IT performance objectives and business performance objectives, right? And so I think people are pretty not complicated, and they're going to do the things that cause them to look successful. Whether or not, I'm not saying that in a negative way at all. I include myself in that, right? You want to look good, you want to do a good job, and you want to be thought of as successful and competent in your organization. And that usually equals not just money, but some sort of, I don't know what the right word is, accolades or whatever inside of your organization, and also bonuses, right? And so when I look inside of an organization, one of the first things I look at is how's your money running, right? If they're not collaborating well together, and it is just as I described. IT's got a bunch of money that they suck off the entire business. They just get money to run, and they operate this machine that's often in a black box. Nobody knows what they do, and it runs. It runs, and people write them checks, and they've got a tremendous amount of power. Marketing communications is a little interesting in that way as well. They tend to spin staff a little bit faster. They get budget as well, not as much as IT, right? Unless it's advertising or commercial related budget, that's a whole different thing. But the whole digital team's often grabbing, for money, trying to get money out of the organization. And the businesses make money. The business units make money for the organization, as I described before. And so, and the compensation's lined up around that. It's almost like an internal enterprise version of, how we all say, don't organize your website based on the business units.
Right.
Of the organization, because that makes for a horrible user experience. We've been saying that forever, and who knows why we haven't learned that lesson yet, but people are still doing that. We also do the same thing team-wise, right? Which instead of saying, we're going to compensate this team holistically based on whether or not you create a unified user experience, the whole experience, it's still cut up in these silos. So I think organizations really need to look at the way that that's the word I was looking for, reward people, right? For success.
Right.
Right. And if that started to line up around the values that you described of working together, right, as a full team, that you actually will be able to make some sorts of changes. Because everywhere I look, it's the same thing. Well, they control that and they control that. It just kind of doesn't make any sense. I'm hoping that, 20, 30 years from now, what we'll see is that the impact of the internet and the web actually re-engineered the enterprise.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
Because it re-engineered everything else. Why would it not do that?
Right.
I mean, right?
Yeah. And I think the thing that I'm thinking about that we haven't touched upon, because it's not relevant to designers coding versus not, or organizational, well, I guess it is for organizational structures, is the centralized versus decentralized groups too. There are areas that, the design team reports into design, and also that could be separate. This is, in a lot of places, there's the separation between designers who create products and the marketing designers, and marketing is its own thing, and this is the digital team. But, if you've got a centralized engineering team and the centralized product team and a centralized design team, then really, who's calling the shots? Who's yes, it's a collective, but isn't it better potentially, I guess every organization is different, if they were organized by, maybe it is by line of business, maybe it is by problem that they're solving, and those teams have both product design and engineering in that same vertical. And there's arguments for both cases, and it depends again on maturity and lots of different factors. And I think, I was playing devil's advocate to myself, because all of what I talked about was a centralized structure. But if it was decentralized, would that solve anything? And the answer is it depends. It's not a yes or no. It's not black or white. It's a gray area, but it's worth thinking about if you're going through a similar situation of what could be solved if we ended up just changing the way our organization is laid out and really start to dive into the changes of redesigning the organization.
Yeah, I agree too. I mean, I think the last thing I have to say on that, and in reaction to what you said, is, you're reminding me of one of my favorite things. And I'll try and dig it out and put it in the show notes. It pops up every now and then in a talk for me, which is I have this execution atom, right? Which is literally an atom, and the nucleus of the atom are performance indicators, so metrics, quantifiable, measurable things that you are trying to achieve. I want to sell this much. I want this many clicks. I want whatever that may be, as broad and or as narrow as that needs to be, depending on what you're doing. So that's half of the nucleus. The other half of the nucleus are standards.
Right.
And so that's basically saying, here's how we work. Whatever you need to have standardized on for the brand, whatever you need to have, all the full set of standards. I put them into design, editorial, publishing and infrastructure, and hosting, right? Hosting and network, right? So from the least technical to the most technical, I hate that description, but just the 360 degrees of standards that you need, right? And everything else that you just described, making things, interacting with stuff, is floating around it like electrons.
Right.
Right? And so it requires, so instead of having a permanent structure, right, you have an impermanent structure. And depending on what you happen to be making at the time, you pull in what you need, but the sun are these performance metrics and these standards, so that you're all have the same basic instructions of what you're trying to do, but how you apply them is situational to either the product design process or whatever it is that you happen to be doing at that time. It reminds me of like back in the 1980s, people tried to do matrix managed organizations and they just couldn't get it done, right? And I always say that I think they could not get it done because they didn't have the right technology tools that would allow people to stay connected in that process, right? But now we have things like Slack, and we've got, I'm looking at you while we're recording this. We have all of these tools that allow people to form temporary teams around a shared goal and objective, get it done and let it go. Right. Now, of course, there's an operational component. Once you've developed something, it has to be maintained. So just take this a little bit with a grain of salt. But I think there's another way to work other than saying, I'm going to engineer this team hard and solid to stay like this, and everything that we make has to go through this one factory. It's like having a single factory that's supposed to make 19 different cars, right, or assembly line. Yep. And it just doesn't work that way. One assembly line is really optimized. I don't even know enough about automobile manufacturing, but let's just assume it makes one model car, various versions of it, whatever the case may be. But it's certainly not making everything that organization makes or that car manufacturer makes. And so I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to create a single factory by hardening this org structure and then thinking that it can turn out anything. Right. I think is irrational, right? And doesn't make a lot of sense. But I also think that the history of the enterprise and the corporation is around this hierarchical, nested thing and not a faceted, free, atomic structure, right? One of them's three-dimensional and interchangeable and has a lot of motion in it, and the other one's hard, right? And so I think, I'm always saying, I hope I live long enough to see. I think a little bit of that's starting to happen now with the result of the pandemic because people are working from home. Right. So you're getting a little bit more detached from that. But I think that that sort of shift is what's going to be required in order to get this done. Does that make sense to you? Because I'm always saying that all the time. I've been saying this for years, and everyone's like, yeah, you're right, but you're kind of crazy. But I think that's what we need.
It definitely makes sense. And there are pieces of it that I'm starting to struggle with. Not struggle, just think about, which is the intent is to make me think about this. How in that structure do we support this matrix of understanding the problem space really well, and also driving's an interesting word, but ensuring, and not from a governance perspective entirely, but really like making sure the quality of each individual discipline or subgroup, their expertise is represented in this. Because what I didn't see, yes, we can definitely get a group of people that are multidisciplinary, cross-functional, aligned on OKRs or objectives or metrics that we want to go after. But still at that point, who's making sure that the individuals building it are doing their best work. We talk a lot about autonomous teams, but there needs to be somebody to coach them through it, to oversee the work, to QA the work, to make sure that it's actually hitting those metrics. And depending again on who you talk to, it will be anyone in those roles will say, oh, it's my responsibility to do that. Oh, like I'm the product person. I'm going to make sure that all of these things are met and the design is met. So I'm just curious, who's going to oversee design quality? Who's going to oversee dev quality? Who's going to oversee, anything else? Who's going to oversee the copy? Who's going to oversee the legal decisions that are made in that situation?
That's fair. That's a fair question. And I think when I put my governance hat on, I would say, okay, always there's going to exist this core team of folks who are establishing standards. So not from an operational maker perspective, right? But just from there will be experts who say, this is the way we do things, and that those things will be articulated and they'll also be deployed. Right. So one of the things I never see inside of an organization that I'm always trying to install is governance ops, which is basically somebody whose job it is to make sure that we actually have standards and that everybody who uses the standards knows what they are. Right. And that can even get as tactical as things like giving people recommendations for hiring people.
Right.
Right. If you're looking for this type of resource, here's what you need, and they need to be able to do these sorts of things. Right. So at least there's some standardization that happens around governance and governance ops, which makes it a little bit more solid. So I would say that half answers your question in terms of the setup. The other part of what you're talking about that I don't know that I have an answer to is real time while we're building.
Right.
Right. But part of me is going, well, isn't that just, if the standard is there, isn't that just taken care of in a QA process? Right.
You're right. And it's also, it's having the right demo process so people get their eyes on things and making sure that it's, seen and those discussions are being had. And, the more I think about that after I ask the question, I've built a solution to this, or we're rolling out a solution to this. We're calling it some sort of guild or brain trust, but we're having a core group of people that are looking at almost everything from a different lens of quality, so that they're not tied to, the KPIs or the OKRs, but they're actually tied to the quality of the work and making sure that it meets the standards and the governance. And it's our own version of governance that we can kind of take these core folks and get their eyes on many things to make sure. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the number one thing that I usually see that is challenging for folks like you who are trying to build a team and get it moving, basically, in an agile but safe way. Just get it operational and moving well, operating well. I shouldn't even use the word agile, but just operating well is this pushing together of governance and ops, right? Because what you described earlier, which is if it's not really clear who's supposed to, in general, be establishing the standard that is going to apply, anyone will think it's their job to do in execution.
Right.
Right. And so what I'm always trying to get people to do is yes, there will always be some weird situational decisions that have to happen when you're designing and building product. But for the most part, you can know what types of standards are going to always apply. Right. And at least 80% of those things can be the same. Right. Or similar, right? And then there's these little nuances. But if you don't actually define that set of stuff up front, you're always trying to do it in a project, in process, and it gets done slightly different over here and slightly different over here, slightly different over here. And that's when you get this sort of cacophony of stuff that happens online. So it's a conscious decision to have to really pull all of that out and say, look, there's a part of the organizations whose job it is to enable everyone else. Right? Make sure we have these standards. Make sure that they're communicated. Make sure that people are trained, right? So that they can actually use things. And even more strongly, make sure that they are implemented. People like to write down standards. And the obvious thing is embedding a template inside of a web content management system. That's implementing a standard. But there are all other sorts of things. Implementing a standard might be making sure that you hire people who can write for the web, because there's no other way to implement your editorial standard other than to hire people who know how to write for the web, right? Like, so it doesn't, sometimes it's not a technology solution. Sometimes it's just training. Sometimes it's not a standard, it's a guideline, because you can't really get a hard standard. So I think there's just a lot of effort that needs to be put into that. But this really turned into not a conversation about
should designers code?
Should designers code?
But
how did we get to this? I think we were like, no, from the very beginning, they don't need to, but they should be. How about this? But they should be on a team that collaborates in such a way that they become familiar with the limitations and practices around that people who do code have to live with. Exactly,
and I think just to even, bring it full circle but tie it all together is, should designers code? They don't have to. Should anyone that's building products understand the capability of the code no matter what their discipline is? Yes, just like the designers and the engineers should understand the business requirements and the needs of the business, and they should understand the design perspective. So it really is, no, you don't have to do someone else's job or what feels like someone else's job. You can if that's what you do, but you should be aware of what everyone else is doing and understand the capabilities of what they're doing so that you can build better products.
There you go, 100%.
Cool.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy surfacing, please rate, review, and follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, consider supporting the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/surfacingpodcast. On the Surfacing Patreon page, you can support the podcast or become a member and gain access to exclusive monthly Ask Me Anything podcasts with Lisa and Andy. If you have suggestions for guests or a topic you'd like to hear about on Surfacing, please reach out via the contact form found at surfacingpodcast.com.